Good evening and welcome to the Mobile Chicane Restaurant. Let us take your hats and your coats and show you to your table. Maybe interest you in tonight's special. It's called the Honda RA099, a car devised by one of Formula One's greatest designers, with the backing of one of the world's largest corporations that is also one of the most successful Formula One engine suppliers of all time. It was driven by a driver with bundles of talent who never had a chance to properly shine, but now, after years of waiting, was ready to step into the spotlight and show the world what he could do with a team re-entering Formula One as a works team for the first time in over 30 years. Sound good? Sound tasty? Well, tough. You can't have it. Fresh out. Never happened. Why? Well, that is a very interesting story. The great Murray Walker once coined the phrase, "if" is a very long word in Formula One. In fact, "if" is F1 spelled backwards. And there have been few more tantalising what-ifs than Honda's flirtation with a full works entry into Formula One in the late 90s. Honda were, and still are, one of the most successful engine suppliers of all time. 6 consecutive World Constructors titles between 1986 and 1991, and 5 consecutive Drivers' Championships from 1987 to 1991. In 1988, with McLaren, Honda won 15 out of 16 Grand Prix that year, and arguably could have won all 16 were it not for some chicane-based shenanigans at Monza. In terms of outright wins and pole positions, they are only beaten by other F1 giants: Ferrari, Mercedes, Ford Cosworth, and Renault. Honda's F1 roots go all the way back to 1964, when they competed at the German Grand Prix. American Ronnie Bucknam was behind the wheel, and after qualifying in 22nd place, made steady progress to finish Honda's first Grand Prix in 13th. Their next 2 races, in Italy and the USA, ended in retirement, but the car had shown the speed to be able to keep up with the likes of 1962 champions BRM and future champions Brabham. It was a promise that translated into the next year's car, with the newly hired Richie Ginter at the wheel, an experienced racer with proven testing pedigree and podium finishes to his name. The Honda RA272 was frequently among the fastest over one lap, but with an atrocious reliability record. Ginter was frequently around the top 4 in qualifying, and then just as frequently stopped at the side of the road during the race. Thankfully, it all came together at the season-ending Mexican Grand Prix, Ginter leading from start to finish, marking not just the first victory for Honda in Formula One, but the first Japanese victory in Formula One too. 1966 failed to follow up on that success, as the new RA273 proved particularly unwieldy. Just the 1 4th-place finish in Mexico would be the highlight of the year. Come 1967, Honda had secured a coup by signing 1964 world champion John Surtees to lead the team. The result was a podium finish in their first race together and a second win for Honda at that year's Italian Grand Prix, with Surtees slipstreaming past reigning champion Jack Brabham to take the checkered flag by just 0.2 of a second. Despite this success, Honda was still a long way away from being championship contenders. It was clear Honda were unable to keep up with the development of the other teams, forcing them to take a dangerous and ultimately fatal gamble. The next car, the RA302, featured 2 never-seen-before concepts on a Formula One car. Firstly, an air-cooled V8 engine and a magnesium alloy chassis. Science explains why this unique combination had never been seen before. Firstly, it's important to note that air alone is not enough to cool a powerful V8 engine. Modern Formula One cars will predominantly use liquid cooling to cool their engines, which circulates its way around the engine and radiators. Despite the drop in weight the removal of a cooling system gave, this cooling method meant that the engine would frequently be overheating. Secondly, magnesium is one of the most volatile metals on the planet. The combination of uncontrolled heat, a tank full of fuel, and a magnesium chassis would prove one of the most disastrous design errors in the history of motorsport. Surtees, understandably, refused to drive a car he dubbed a potential death trap. However, another driver, Joe Schlesser, eager to prove himself to the factory team, agreed to drive the car at the next round, the French Grand Prix. On lap 2, Schlesser skidded onto an embankment where the fuel tanks were ripped open. The car ignited instantly, killing Schlesser. Bizarrely, Honda promptly built a second version of the car and asked Surtees to drive it later that year, which he sensibly refused. Enough was enough, and Honda pulled out of Formula One at the year's end, their legacy somewhat tarnished. Schlesser, meanwhile, was forever memorialised by friend Guy Ligier. Ligier entered cars and sports car racing and in Formula One from 1970 onwards, and all chassis were christened with a JS as part of the name. By 1983, Honda were back in Formula One, though only as an engine supplier, and as stated earlier, it would be a period of pure domination for Honda-powered machinery. After a quiet debut with a Spirit team in 1983, Honda would join forces with the likes of Lotus, McLaren and Williams, and lead drivers such as Nelson Piquet, Alain Prost and Ayrton Senna to championship glory. But by the end of 1992, Japan had plunged into a massive economic recession, and with a growing need to cut costs, Honda pulled out of Formula One once more. It was perhaps in the nick of time to save their reputation. McLaren and Honda managed to win 4 races that year, but it was otherwise dominated by Williams and Renault. Honda passed over their engines to tuners Mugen, who would go on to supply the likes of Lotus and Ligier with reworked Honda engines. Successes were few and far between, that there were a brace of point-scoring finishes and a surprise victory with Ligier at the 1996 Monaco Grand Prix. Further down the line, Mugen Honda would power Jordan to 3 Grand Prix victories and a third-place finish in the 1999 Constructors' Championship. Honda ended up moving over to the American IndyCar Series for 1994 to satisfying that racing itch, but at a fraction of the cost of a Formula One budget. To the surprise of no one, they took to it like a me at an all-you-can-eat buffet. They won their first race the next year, and then won 4 manufacturers' titles and every driver's title across the next 6 years. But that desire for F1 success, perhaps as a constructor in their own right, never went away. Throughout this time, there were always rumours that Honda were considering returning to Formula One. Honda engineers would construct prototypes, and there was even a time when Japanese F1 veteran Satoru Nakajima took on a few kilometres of private testing, though none of these concepts would ever really go anywhere. It wasn't until 1998 that Honda decided to finally utilise the enthusiasm shown by their engineers, which, coupled with a recovering economy, meant that perhaps the time was ripe for a return. And so began the Honda Racing Developments Programme, otherwise known as the HRD. Problem was, it had been several years since they'd last made an engine, and several more years on top of that since they'd last designed and raced a car. First on the contact list was Italian constructors Dallara, veterans of chassis building across Formula One, IndyCar, sports cars, and lower series formula for the past 20 years. However, Honda still needed someone to design the car and lead the project, preferably someone with a wealth of F1 experience success to boot. Enter Harvey Postlethwaite. Postlethwaite's F1 experience went all the way back to the early 70s at the Hesketh team, where he designed the Hesketh 308 and 308B, which saw the team achieve several podium positions, culminating in victory at the 1975 Dutch Grand Prix with future world champion James Hunt. Further race victories came with the Wolf team in the late 70s, before Postlethwaite was personally selected by the legendary Enzo Ferrari to reverse the fortunes of a struggling Ferrari team. Constructors' titles followed in 1982 and 83, and several more race wins, before Postlethwaite moved on to Tyrrell. 2 spells there and 1 with Sauber failed to bring any more race wins, but did bring a reputation for Postlethwaite cars, consistently providing an upturn in fortune from previous struggles, such as Jean Alesi's epic battle in his Tyrrell with Ayrton Senna's McLaren at Phoenix in 1990, and reliable point-scoring machinery, as proven in the hands of J.J. Leto and Carl Wendlinger at Sauber in 1993. Despite his recent experiences at underfunded constructors, Postlethwaite remained one of the biggest and most respected names in the F1 paddock. Postlethwaite penned the RA099, a simple yet elegant design that left plenty of space for aerodynamic improvements down the line, as the car was subjected to more testing. It was a solid base to work from, and was matched by the reacquaintance of Honda to their good friends Mugen to supply an engine for the car. Honda and Postlethwaite crunched the numbers, ran the data, and performed several complex experiments to reach the conclusion that, whilst having this car was all well and good, it would probably go a HE double hockey sticks of a lot faster with someone behind the wheel of it. And much like every Segway in every heist movie ever, thankfully, Harvey Postlethwaite knew just the guy for the job. Enter Jos Verstappen. Verstappen had made his F1 debut with Benetton in 1994. Prior to that, he was a German Formula 3 champion, and that success opened the door to a test with footwork at Estoril in Portugal. Verstappen promptly set a time that would have put him an incredible 10th on the grid at that year's Portuguese Grand Prix, in his first time in an F1 car. After the test, He was contacted by 12 different F1 teams, the only exceptions being Williams and Ferrari, and he signed for Benetton as a test driver. When regular driver JJ Leto broke a vertebra in a pre-season testing crash, Verstappen found himself parachuted into a race seat for the first 2 races. It was a daunting prospect, going up against the then up-and-coming Michael Schumacher in a team that would go on to win the Drivers' Championship that year. He would crash out in Brazil and then spun off after running in the points at the Pacific Grand Prix. Leto was back for the next round, but failed to impress, and was rested by the team just 4 races later, promoting Jos back into a race seat. Highlights included 2 third-place finishes in Hungary and Belgium, and more points in Portugal, but there were still errors, crashes, and most infamously of all, and admittedly not his fault, being involved in a huge fire in Germany. 2 races before the end of the season, the experienced Johnny Herbert was available, and Benetton, keen to secure the Constructors' Championship, signed Johnny up for the remainder of the season and for 1995. The next few years weren't kind to Jos. He continually found himself shunted around from season to season, never staying at one team for more than a year, always showing flashes of brilliance, but with little in the way of results in unreliable and underperforming machinery, often having to leave teams owing to factors out of his control. He raced for Simtek in 1995, only for the team to bankrupt after 5 races. Then a season at Footwork in 1996, where he seemed a surefire bet for a second year at the team, only for the sudden availability of world champion Damon Hill to push him aside. Off to Tyrrell for 1997, he again looked set for another year there, only for new owners to insist on taking on paid driver Ricardo Rosset for the next year. Left on the side for 1998, he was given a shot at Stewart, replacing the underperforming Jan Magnussen. But an uncompetitive car and unbalanced team didn't help his aspirations, and he was replaced by Johnny Herbert the next year. To rub salt in the wounds, 1999 would be Stewart's most competitive season, culminating in victory at the European Grand Prix. Throughout this time, there were lightning starts, excellent drives into point-scoring places, and great wheel-to-wheel racing, but let down time and time again with unreliable machinery. The resulting racing record for Jos Verstappen by the end of 1998 was 57 races, 11 points, 10 of which were from his first year with Benetton. He'd also somewhat unfairly earned the nickname Crash Tappen, something that might seem familiar to another Verstappen nowadays, which kept him from drives at the top of the grid, whilst his lack of financial backing kept him from drives at other underfunded teams. Thankfully, when facing a year on the sidelines, a friend was there to offer a helping hand. Postlethwaite and Verstappen had worked closely together at Tyrrell in 1997, and Postlethwaite strongly believed in Verstappen's driving abilities to not only develop the car, but race it successfully too. So confident and excited was Jos by the prospect of leading a works effort by Honda nonetheless, that he signed a 3-year contract with them. With the team now together, it was time to go testing. Heading to Jerez, things could have hardly gone better for the team. There was no reliability gremlins or a worrying lack of pace. Instead, Verstappen and the RA099 reliably pounded around the circuit. The combination of the decently powerful Mugen Honda engine, a tightly designed aerodynamic package from Postlethwaite, and the dependable Dallara chassis was proving to be a winning one. With Verstappen behind the wheel, the car was setting lap times comfortably in the midfield range, alongside the likes of Benetton and Stewart, and was showing promising pace across both short and long runs. Further improvements came at the next test, in Mugello. Now with a flashy red paint job, the car really screamed, "Look at me, with my flashy new red paint job," but also a degree of professionalism and dedication to the project. The lap times were still strong, right on the pace of other more experienced teams on the grid. Jos in particular was waxing lyrical about the superb handling of the chassis and the best engine he'd ever experienced. Not just that, but he found the team dedicated to getting his feedback and responding accordingly. After so many luckless years at the back, it must have felt like everything was finally going right. Despite the promising form, there was still a reluctance on Honda's part. So many other manufacturers, like Lamborghini and Porsche, had entered Formula One over the years, only to crash and burn and retreat, licking their wounds, reputations scratched, and pondering how many metaphors it was socially acceptable to cram into one sentence, though that one may mostly apply to me. Whilst Honda President Nobuhiko Kawamoto was all in favour of the project, many of the rest of the governing board members found their feet hitting a temperature of 0 degrees and dropping steadily. they would rather Honda returned as solely an engine provider to the BAR team. Postlethwaite came back with an alternate plan, that Honda Racing Development's team would enter F1 as a private team under an alternate name, to which Honda could provide the engines for. Then, if the results proved promising, the HRD team could evolve into an official Honda Works team. That Postlethwaite was so determined to ensure that the team would be on the grid was the clearest sign of his belief in the project and the potential it had. Little did we know that fate was about to deal the cruelest of blows. On April 15, 1999, Harvey Postlethwaite suffered a heart attack while supervising the testing of the Honda in Spain. He passed away the same day, aged 55. Postlethwaite had been the real heart and soul of the whole project, and with him gone, everything abruptly lurched to a halt. Sadly, it seems that even if Postlethwaite had lived, the project would have still been abandoned. Articles from the time seem to suggest that the Honda board had already made the decision to drop the project, in part due to pressure from the American branch of the Honda Motor Company, who wanted nothing to do with an F1 program, and that Postlethwaite's proposal for Honda to enter as a private team was a proposal put forward in a last-ditch attempt to save the project, and one that would have been in vain. Honda would go on to supply BAR with engines from 2000 to 2005, with the RA099 allegedly becoming BAR's 2001 car. At the end of 2004, Honda purchased 45% of the BAR team, and in September 2005, purchased the remaining 55% share to become a full works entry for 2006. Jenson Button memorably won his first race in Hungary that year, as Honda finished fourth in the Constructors. But the next two seasons proved a disaster, and Honda withdrew from F1 once more at the end of 2008. The team became Brawn GP, surprise champions of 2009, before morphing into the official Mercedes Works team, who haven't really done much of note since then and aren't particularly worth talking about. For Jos Verstappen, the project's abandonment left the Dutchman completely in the lurch. No amount of Dutch courage could make up for the fact that he'd been the lead driver of a Works team for the first time, only to have his F1 future snatched away from him once more. A faint, vaguely corporeal carrot was dangled in front of him in the form of a test with Jordan, helpfully pushed forward by the crew from Mugen Honda. It was a test with a view to replace the struggling and unmotivated Damon Hill before the season was over, in a proven race-winning car. Jos's lap times were better than the team's regular test driver, Shinji Nakano, but only by a small margin, and were some way off the pace of the team's regular drivers. Both this disappointing performance, and with Hill postponing his retirement until the end of the year, left Verstappen on the sidelines once more. In the end, Verstappen will return to Arrows for 2000 and 2001, before a final season with Minardi in 2003. It was the same old story for Jos. Unreliable and uncompetitive machinery that frequently let him down despite his best efforts to shine. He called it quits at the end of 2003, not wanting another season of driving around at the back. Since then, he's mentored his son Max into Formula One, and seems to be doing a pretty decent job at it. It's impossible to know how the Honda project would have gone. Certainly all the best ingredients were gathered together. A fast, reliable car, with the backing of a global brand, driven by a fast and ready-to-shine star, designed by one of the greatest designers F1 has ever had. History tells us that doesn't necessarily equal success, but it's always a good sign. But in this hypothetical alternate reality where Honda did enter, just how long would they have stuck around for? Honda do not have a shining reputation when it comes to sticking with it in Formula One. Their F1 intentions are a struggle to interpret. Maybe it's the fact that success has come so easily to them in other pastures, like MotoGP and IndyCar. And as legendary football coach Vince Lombardi says, winning isn't everything, it's the only thing. Maybe that explains their brief return from 2006 to 2008, or their abrupt announcement last year that they'd be leaving Formula One at the end of 2021. It's championships or bust for Honda, and when the going gets tough, Honda gets going. We'll never know if that Honda project could have given them that championship success that they craved so much. One chassis is all that remains from the project, and it sits, gathering dust, alongside numerous other Honda prototypes at the Honda Collection Hall at the Twin Ring Motegi racetrack in Japan. The F1 logo that adorns that wing stirs up memories of that phrase from Murray Walker. What if?